Okay, we're going to start from scratch once again, and this time around we're going to build a more complex web part to help demonstrate a lot of features that you're definitely going to want to be familiar with when you're building your own web parts, not the least of which is connecting to our SharePoint environment and consuming SharePoint's REST web services. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to build a web part that we're going to call Dash. And this web part is going to be able to consume some list data from SharePoint lists and then visualize that into some sort of really cool chart visualization. So let's go ahead and get started by creating our web part. We'll make a directory called Dash. We'll cd into that and we'll run our Yeoman Microsoft / SharePoint generator. Our solution name is going to be Dash. We are using SharePoint Online. We're going to use the current folder. We're going to accept the default admin settings. We are building a web part in this case, and our web part name is going to be Dash. And of course, we're going to choose the React framework just as before. And this is going to take just a moment, so we'll give that a minute to finish up. Okay, great. Let's open this up in Visual Studio Code. We can have a look, and I'm also going to go ahead and switch back and start up the Gulp local workbench. And in our workbench, we'll go ahead and add the Dash web part to the page. And let's take a look at our solution inside of Visual Studio Code. So just as before, we have our source folder, and within web parts, we have our Dash folder that contains both our React components as well as our web part entry file, or dash webpart.ts. And the first thing we should look at before you connect to SharePoint's web services and start consuming data, you should be aware of a very important utility that is available on your base client-side web part class. And you can see here that our Dash web part is extending that class. So we do get some functionality from that class that you can access using the this keyword from your methods within this class. So for example, if I just come down here and inside any method, I can just say this dot, and you can see all this cool stuff you get. And it's worth looking through the descriptions of all this to kind of see what you have available. But in particular, there's this property called context, which is of type web part context. And this is a really important utility property available on your web parts, and you can use this to access all sorts of information about the context of your web part. And what I mean by that is whenever your web part is placed on a page, its context contains information about who's logged in, about what site or subsite it's currently on, about what page it's currently on, and you just get all sorts of useful information that you can utilize, especially when you're interacting with the web services. Because, for example, you could say, what are all the lists on the current site that I'm on? And then that way, when you add this web part to multiple sites, it can kind of be more portable and more extensible and configurable in that way. So let's take a look at here. We can just say this.context. And you have quite a few things in here. You have all kinds of properties that you can look at, but in particular, we have this context.page context. And then if you look into this object, it actually has information about our user, for example. So I can actually get information about the currently authenticated user, which is kind of handy. I can also get information about the web or the subsite that I'm currently on. Also the site or the site collection that this web part is currently placed on. And this is all information that's extremely useful when you're making your web requests to the various SharePoint REST service endpoints. You sometimes need this information to say, I want to get a list that's on the site collection or the top level web, or I want to get a list that's on the current web or the current subsite that I'm viewing. And that context is really important to make sure that you can have certain functionality in your web part based on what it needs to do. Also on this context object, if you go back and hit dot here, you'll also notice it has an HTTP client. And that's just kind of a utility. You don't have to use this as your HTTP client. You could certainly install an NPM package such as Axios and configure that to do all of your HTTP requests as needed. But you have this built into your web part context, and you could use the methods on here such as fetch, get, and post if you need them. And that's kind of handy. That's definitely useful just in case you do need to reach for that. It's just kind of something that is built in. And similarly, you have what is called the SP HTTP client. And really the only difference, it still has those same methods, fetch, get, and post, is that this SP HTTP client is kind of pre-configured to automatically reuse the authentication token that the current user has. So if you're viewing a web part in SharePoint Online, for example, you're already going to be logged in. Somebody has to log in to view that page that the web part is on. And so they're already authenticated. And using this SP HTTP client, you can turn around and say, go out and get me all of the list on the current web. And by using the current user's authentication token, it's only going to retrieve the list that that user has access to, which is very, very good because it maintains all the security and all the great permissions and such that are set up on your site. But it allows you to kind of reuse that authentication when you're making a web request, and it is a lot easier to set up. So it's very convenient. And we're going to use that in just a moment. But another thing you should be aware of on this keyword is there are some very handy, what we could call lifecycle methods. So everything that starts with on, that's a method here. So you can see there's all these on something methods. So for example, there's on init. Whenever this web part is initialized or added to the page, or the page refreshes and it first starts up, you're going to run this on init method. And that can be very handy to kind of have some one-time logic for your web part where it says when the page loads or when the web part's added to the page, then do this. Similarly, you have an on dispose that's going to run when the web part is closing up or kind of wrapping up if you need to do any sort of cleanup logic. And you have some methods that occur when the property pane is being interacted with. So maybe when you first open the property pane, you have this on property pane configuration start, and also on property pane field change, so when something changes. And these are all just very handy. They're definitely something you should be familiar with because there's going to be times when you're building web parts where you may need to reach for these lifecycle methods and the context of your web part to do some special functionality, some SharePoint type things. So let's go ahead and use this now. I'm going to come down below the render method here, and we'll use one of these lifecycle methods. And in this case, we're going to use the public on init method, which returns a promise of type void. And you can find that out just by hovering over it. You can see there it returns promise of type void. And in this case, we're overriding the parent class's method, the base client side web part on init. And that still needs to have its methods and its functionality run on initialization. So we need to return super.onInit. So that's going to run the base client side web parts initialization. And then we can say when that's done, then we can run whatever custom code we want. So we could very simply say, console.log web part fired up. And then if we go into our local workbench and we open the console is very noisy. So we might have to search through this a little bit to find that. But if we scroll up just a bit, you'll see right there, it fired that off once as soon as the page loaded, which is great. So another thing we could do inside of this onInit method is whenever this web part is initialized, we could console log this.context.pagecontext.user. And then you get this information about the current user, such as the display name, their email address, etc., which is very, very useful in certain cases when you are building out some web part functionality. So for example, we can just console log the display name of the current user. And in our local workbench, if we scroll up just a bit, you'll see it logs user1. Now I'm not actually authenticated in the local workbench, so this is just some dummy data, if you will. And in some cases, that is what you'll get out of your web part context in your local workbench. But if we switch over and open up our remote workbench, and we add this dash web part. Let me open the console first. And we add our dash web part to the page. You'll see, sure enough, it knows who I am. It is actually logging my display name based on my authentication to Office 365. Another thing that's very useful in your page context is, again, you can get information about your current site or your current web. So for example, I could get my absolute URL of the current web or subsite that I am viewing based on where this web part is placed. So if we console log that, we jump back into our local workbench. Let's clear this. And let's scroll up a bit. And you'll see right there, it's got kind of a dummy address, a contoso.com address, but it says /site/workbench. And if I do the same thing over here in my remote workbench, you'll see it's going to log a real SharePoint web URL. And that's especially useful for working with web services, because typically your web services are going to need to start with a current web URL, and then you add an endpoint onto the end. So we're going to use that to actually use our web services in just a moment. Very cool. So let's actually try using the SP-HTTP client on the context object that is available to make our very first REST endpoint request. And we're going to do that by running this.context.sp-HTTP client. So that's that HTTP client that's configured for SharePoint. And then we have our fetch, get, and post. And depending on what you're doing, you'll have to look at some documentation to find what all of these endpoints are. We're going to work with several of them and throughout this building this web part that we're working on, this dash web part. But in most cases, you're either going to do a get or a post. A post is when you're creating or you're updating items, and a get is going to be when you're just retrieving data from your SharePoint site. But in this case, we'll make a real simple request. We'll run the get method, and you'll see this accepts a URL, which is the endpoint URL for the SharePoint REST service that you want to consume in this case. You also need a configuration, which is of type SP-HTTP client configuration. And then you can pass some optional options if you need to set additional headers and other things, depending on what you're doing. So what we're going to do is we're going to build a template string, and we're going to first, for our building our URL, we're going to use this.context.pagecontext.web.absolute URL. So we're actually going to make this web request or this get request from our current web. So no matter where this web part is placed, it's always going to start with the current web address. And then on the end of that, I can say /_API/list. That's kind of one of the most basic web requests that we can make. We just want to get all of the lists that are on the current web or the current subsite that we're viewing. The second argument here needs to be a configuration object. And this basically describes the behavior of your GET request that's going to go out to the REST services in this case. And you certainly could look up the documentation of this SP-HTTP client configuration interface and build your own. But the nice thing is Microsoft has kind of developed one that you can just import into this file very easily. So for example, I could say SP-HTTP client. And if I autocomplete that, it's going to import that from a package up above in our imports. And we'll say .configurations.v1. And if you actually hover over this object, it tells you a little bit about what's in there. But basically what it's doing is it's doing things like saying, we want a JSON response. If you don't configure that, by default, the web services will actually give you XML back, which are very difficult to work with in JavaScript. So you do need to do a couple of configuration options whenever you're making this request. And if you are using your own HTTP client like Axios or something else, you need to do quite a bit to get it configured first. You need to do things like pass through your OAuth authentication token that you have in your current context. You need to set up some headers that set your JSON preferences and all this stuff. But the good news is all that's taken care of for us in this case because we're using the web part context SP-HTTP client, and we're using this kind of built-in configuration object. And then we can say .then with our response from that request, we'll take that response and then we can do something with it. And in this case, if you look at that response dot, it is if you hover over it, it is an SP-HTTP client response, which kind of has some built-in methods and properties on it. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the response JSON just yet, because that's actually a method, a JSON method that returns yet another promise. So what you'll have to do is you'll have to run response.json.then, and then with the JSON that comes back, we can say console.log JSON. So just to reiterate what we're doing, on the initialization of this web part, we're going to use our SP-HTTP client to make a request to the current web's absolute URL /API/list. We're going to use that default configuration, and we're going to take our response JSON and we're going to log it to the console. So let's give that a save and we'll try this out in our remote workbench. I'm going to give this a refresh. And you'll see after a moment down here, here is our actual response we got back from SharePoint REST services. And in this case, it's a JSON object that has a value array with 50 items in it. And these 50 items, each one is actually a list that's in our current SharePoint web or a subsite that we're viewing. And if we just open one of these at random, it has all sorts of properties that are telling us all about this list. Probably many, many properties that you'll never, ever use. I don't even know what half of these things are. But one thing in particular you could look at is it has a title. So you can see the title of this list is called Produce Revenue. That's just a dummy list that we have set up in this current web. So this is very cool. We have made our first web request to SharePoint Web Services, and that's great. You can imagine that you could do all sorts of things with the responses that you get back because you can do a lot more than just get your current list. For example, with this produce revenue list that we see here, I could say list/get by title, produce revenue, and then I could say /items. So maybe I want to get the items from that list. And again, if we save this and we come back to our remote workbench and give that a refresh, let's clear the console. You'll see here we get a JSON object with a value array with 3 items in it. And each one of these actually represents an item that's in that list. So if I open one of these, you can see it has some data in it, like this April 28, February 19, January 16, March 32. That's just some data that's in that list. And again, there's a bunch of other stuff in here that you maybe don't care about, like the content type ID and when it was created, and this unique GUID or globally unique identifier string, and just all this stuff that you may not need, but you are actually getting the actual SharePoint list data as well. And one thing to mention about these REST services in SharePoint is that they are designed around a standard called OData. And you can read more about that at odata.org. But basically what that means is for all those common things you would normally need to do with REST web services, such as filtering or ordering your results or doing paging and things like that, you have this standard called OData, which kind of describes how you would do that. So if you do want to learn more about these REST services and how you can use them, it's going to be a really good idea to check out the documentation at odata.org. But for example, if we don't want to get all of these fields within this specific list, we could go in and add an OData expression onto the end of this URL. So we can add a URL parameter, a query string parameter called select equals. And using select, you can select which fields you actually want to get back from your list. So I could maybe select the title, the January, and the February data. And then if we save that, we come back into our remote workbench and we refresh, it's going to change the data, the format of the data that we get back. So now if we open one of these, it's going to be a much shorter list of properties. So you see there is our title, which is oranges, and then our January and February data. It still has this weird OData stuff that just kind of you get back on every request, but it's going to be a much shorter list of fields that you can access. You can also do things like filtering within here. So for example, if I want to filter only when the February value is greater than 20, we should get less items. So I could say, and filter equals February is greater than 20. And if we save that, previously we got 3 items back. If we give this a refresh in our remote workbench, you'll see now we filtered out one of those results. We only have 2 items that have been returned in this case because we have applied a filter. And this is all just OData stuff. And I should say for the most part, the SharePoint Web Services follow the OData standard. There's some things that you'll see in OData that you just can't do in the SharePoint REST services. But for the most part, all those common things like ordering and filtering and all that stuff, you can do inside of your web requests that you build in SharePoint REST services. And this is the pattern. This is the pattern you're going to use to go out and get data and retrieve it and bring it into your web part as a JSON object. And then you can do whatever you want with it. You could plug it into a chart. You could plug it into some sort of table library that you get from NPM. And that's the really cool thing about these REST services is you're just getting JSON data back, but that JSON data is tied behind the scenes to a real SharePoint list or a real SharePoint library. And it basically allows you to totally customize how you want to display your data or how you want users to interact with that data, because you can also do things like making additions to lists. You can create new items, you can update items, and pretty much all of those CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, you can do inside of these REST services. And you're just going to follow this pattern of going out, making a request, and then doing something with the response. However, there are a couple of issues with what we've created here. So first and foremost, if we go back to our local workbench, you'll notice if we go all the way to the bottom here and we scroll up to where it would normally have console logged our response, we're getting this error that says failed to fetch. And that's because in our local workbench, we don't have an API. There is no SharePoint environment. This is all just running locally. So we can't actually get anything from this web URL that we've built inside of our custom onInit method. And that's an issue because if you do want to actually test and work with this in the local workbench, none of your HTTP client requests are going to work. And typically the way you're going to handle this is you would have some sort of check in here to see if you're running in the local environment. So for example, I could say if environment.type is equal to environment type.local. And you'll see it. You can check to see if you're in a local environment or a SharePoint environment, which is when you're online or you're live in the remote workbench. But you can say if you're running locally, then do something else. Return some mock data object that you have created that kind of mimics the same response you would get from the REST services, but then this allows you to kind of work locally as well and test with mock data that you have created. And that's great, but what you're going to find is if you use this pattern where you do the local environment check, and then if you're local, you return some mock data, otherwise, run your GET request, you could be potentially writing this in dozens of places throughout your application, and that's going to get really tedious really quickly. Not only that, but right now your web part context is only available in your entry file, in our -webpart.ts file, which means that if we want our React components to actually utilize this, then we need to pass this context, which has our page context and our SP HTTP client on it, to all of those React components that are going to use it. And using that React one-way data flow, that is also going to be tedious because we're going to have to pass this all over the place so that it's accessible in all the areas where we need it. And then furthermore, we haven't done anything with doing things like checking the loading state. So informing the user that we're waiting on this response. And we haven't done anything with error handling. So if the user loses connection while they're waiting on a response, we haven't notified the user that something has gone wrong. So all of those things add up to having to do this complexity all over the place, over and over and over, and there's probably a better way to handle that. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to take all of this onInit functionality that we have written here, and we're going to move this into an external class, an abstraction, if you will, that's going to allow us to import that class, that service, into any other area of our application, including our web part entry file or a React component itself. And then that's going to make our context and our SP HTTP client very portable so that we can basically use these methods everywhere. And then we can kind of have a centralized place where we can control things like the error handling and catching issues with our promises not returning. And that's going to allow us to work with this much, much easier. So we're going to delete all this. And in the next lesson, we're going to come back to this and kind of reassess a better way to utilize the HTTP client and our web part context. If working with asynchronous programming is something that you've never done before, so in particular working with things like promises and kind of doing the .then syntax in your JavaScript, if that is new to you, it's probably worth your time to go brush up on asynchronous programming. There's a lot of great resources, and I'll post a couple links in the video description down below to help you get started if that is something entirely new to you. Otherwise, let's jump into the next lesson and learn how we can improve this process and make this a little bit easier to use in our application.